The world watched in horror as violence erupted on the 7th of October, with the deadly Hamas terror strikes claiming more than 1,400 Israeli lives. In retaliation, Israel launched an intense military campaign against Gaza, including a limited ground operation. Amid all this chaos, one question has stood out. Why isn't Israel using its nuclear weapons, being the only state in the region to possess advanced nuclear technology? Why cannot Israel at least use the threat of nuclear weapons to enforce deterrence, which is one of the reasons why nation states decide to cross the Rubicon? On Crux Decode, we try to understand the complexities behind the nuclear question and delve into the challenges of using nuclear weapons in this region and in this context. Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas in the world, with over 2.2 million people crammed into a 200 square mile region. The use of nuclear weapons would undoubtedly lead to catastrophic collateral damage, resulting in a disproportionate loss of civilian lives compared to the number of Hamas terrorists who could potentially be eliminated. It's a moral and humanitarian concern which simply cannot be ignored, even in the face of the extreme provocation that happened on the 7th of October. The basic principle of nuclear weapons as a deterrent does not apply in this case either. Nuclear deterrence usually functions between two nation-states who are locked in a conventional war. The threat of nuclear retaliation acts as the ultimate escalatory step, preventing both sides from taking that step because it means the end of humankind in that region, as was evidenced in 1945 when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed with an atomic bomb. But when a state is set up against a non-state terrorist organization, this logic of conventional deterrence does not hold. Hamas does not have a nation-state to deter. They are an asymmetric threat. Asymmetric warfare pits a state against a non-state actor, often in densely populated areas. In this case, Hamas has been accused in the past of using civilians as human shields, and that makes it extremely difficult for Israel to target terrorists without causing mass civilian casualties. The use of nuclear weapons in such a context would only exacerbate the moral, legal, and political questions involved. In fact, using nuclear weapons against Hamas in Gaza would not just violate international law, it will also have far-reaching consequences for Israel's international standing as well as its security. It would likely lead to widespread condemnation. It could also trigger a regional conflict, and that is exactly the opposite of what Israel needs. And that is completely also against Israel's strategic interests at this given point of time. All these years, Israel has never explicitly said that it does possess nuclear weapons. That was always implicitly understood. The Israeli nuclear program dates back to the mid-1950s, when the country's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, began to explore a nuclear insurance plan in order to offset the combined conventional superiority of all the Arab states. He realized that as long as the Palestinian cause was a potent rallying point for all the Arab states, he will need an X factor as a collective deterrence. As historian Avner Cohen writes, Ben-Gurion's determination to launch the nuclear project was the result of strategic intuition and obsessive fears. This was not, as the historian noted, derived from a well-thought-out plan. Ben-Gurion believed that Israel needed nuclear weapons as some kind of an insurance if it could no longer compete with the Arab world in an arms race. Also, nuclear weapons are a weapon of last resort in case of an extreme military contingency. Ben-Gurion tapped Shimon Peres, who later would go on to become Israel's prime minister, to lead the nuclear program. Under Peres's leadership, Israel purchased a substantial package which included a research reactor and plutonium separation technology from France. This was in 1957. It also bought 20 tons of heavy water from Norway in 1959. The grounds for the Negev Nuclear Research Center were broken near Dimona in early 1958. This facility ran for close to 10 years as a civilian enterprise. Even the United States, Israel's closest ally, had no clue about what was exactly going on in this 3-floor underground facility. Since the late 1960s, every Israeli government has practiced a policy of nuclear ambiguity, amimut as it is known, deliberately obscuring whether Israel actually possesses a nuclear weapon, and if so, how big is its arsenal. Since the mid-1960s, this policy has been publicly expressed and even recently reaffirmed by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The phrase is, "We won't be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East." Israel's policy of deliberate ambiguity was enshrined during the country's negotiations with the United States over the purchase of F-4 Phantom aircrafts during the 60s. During a meeting at the Pentagon in November of 1968, Israel's then ambassador to the United States, Yitzhak Rabin, who would also later go on to become Israel's prime minister, said that he would not consider a weapon that had not been tested to be actually considered a weapon. In other words, Israel construed its pledge not to be the first to introduce nuclear weapons to actually mean that introduction was not about the physical possession, but about the public acknowledgement of that possession. After the end of the Cold War, Israel began to fear that America was giving tacit support for Israel's undeclared nuclear arsenal, and that would ultimately fade. America at that time had been actively engaging other Middle East powers for a two-state solution. It pursued the Camp David talks, then there was the Oslo Peace Accords. The Clinton administration at that time had made a public commitment to make the Middle East a nuclear weapons-free zone. As a result, Israel had requested that each American president since Bill Clinton sign a letter indicating that any future US arms control efforts would not affect Israel's nuclear stockpile. There's also a lot of speculation about how big Israel's nuclear arsenal really is. Over the past several decades, news media reports, think tanks, authors, analysts, they've all presented a wide range of possibilities for just how big the size of Israel's nuclear stockpile is. Some have said 75 warheads. Some of the more outrageous ones have suggested 400 warheads. Delivery vehicles for these warheads have been listed as aircraft, ballistic missiles, artillery, that's tactical or battlefield weapons like shells, landmines, and more recently we also saw reports of sea-launched cruise missiles. But the absence of any public document, and because of this deliberate policy of amimut, it becomes very difficult to make an educated guess. Now, while the question of why Israel has not used nuclear weapons, either in this conflict or any of the conflicts in the past, that is a complex one. The challenges and the potential consequences of doing so are extremely clear. The loss of civilian life, the inapplicability of the deterrence theory, and the context of asymmetric warfare between Israel and Hamas would make the use of nuclear weapons highly problematic. Instead, the international community's calls for diplomatic efforts, ceasefire agreements, and humanitarian assistance to resolve this conflict appear to be more realistic. The situation in Gaza is a stark reminder of the harsh realities of asymmetric warfare and the limitations of nuclear deterrence. As the world watches and hopes for a peaceful resolution, the use of nuclear weapons remains at best an option left unexplored.